Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight marks the end of the competition that we've been hosting for the last 4 days, with our final feature being the incredibly talented The Dark Narrator. I hope you do enjoy tonight's stories, finishing off with a bang with 20 humanoid encounters I'm sure you'll all enjoy. Don't forget that when the video is over, you'll be able to find links to the Dark Narrator's channel and video on screen and in the description. But without further ado, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I've never shared this before, and I'm not sure where to begin. But I feel that I need to relay this story in a public place, in case that something happens to me. I have left information as a precaution that my brother may find if I were to go missing. Honestly, I am really perplexed by this whole thing, as I consider myself a big skeptic of many things like this, and I tried to write this meeting I had off with this very strange person about 12 years ago. Because of something else that has happened a few days ago, which I believe to be related to this guy, I feel the need to revisit the possibility of this being more than just an oddity. To put into perspective why I believe this man was related to what happened to me recently, I need to explain a bit about my background, and the first time I believed I encountered things associated with this guy. I am Southern and almost 30 now. The incident related to this man, who I'll call the Rancher, happened when I was 18, working my first real job. It was the fall of 2007 when I met this guy, but I believe I may have come into contact with these things which I now heavily associate with him when I was 10 years old. I lived in Tennessee for the first part of my childhood. There is a very small town outside of Knoxville, a couple of hours away, where my grandfather had a farm. We'd visit semi-regularly, and I would go and see the cows and chickens he had raised. We would sometimes pay him for meat when he was going to slaughter one of the cows and freeze it for meals for months. They also had corn and other crops there that he would harvest. His main source of income, though, was a retirement from the military, and he had several sheds and workshops where he would fix discarded appliances and vehicles and sell them. The first incident in question was during the summer of 1998 on his farm. I was actually out playing with one of their border collies, while my granddad was out in the field feeding the cattle. The farm is in the hills, as this area is part of the Smoky Mountains, and the farm was quite large. I don't know how large off the top of my head, but large enough that it had big fields and a smaller area for crops, and his property encompassed a very large portion of the surrounding wooded area. Me and the dog, whose name was Sweetie, wandered up into the wooded area a bit during the times he was feeding the cattle. I was alone except for Sweetie when this occurred, and I was so young at the time that the memory was, and still is to some extent, a bit fuzzy. But the important part is still very clear. During this particular excursion into the woods, me and Sweetie came across what I can only describe as a large tree with a hole beneath it. As we came up onto the hole, I looked down into it, and I couldn't see the bottom, and it was pitch black. For the longest time, I thought that this was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but I believe what I saw then was real now. My head started almost buzzing, and I felt my hair stand on end. I started shaking, but I couldn't look away from it. I felt like if I started to run, I would die. It's really hard to describe the sensation, but I would call it an impending sense of dread. There were eyes looking back at me from this hole, but I couldn't see the body at first. Then I saw what looked like a smile and a very small body of this humanoid thing. Its body was entirely black, like freshly laid asphalt. It was unnaturally black. I mean, it was like looking into the absence of light. The only light portions were the eyes, and eventually the mouth. It kind of smiled at me, and I felt like I was going to die looking at it, but I couldn't run away. After that, it's like I can't remember exactly what happened at my next memory. It was me, walking back for dinner. I should also tell you that we could not find Sweetie after that, and I felt so bad, because I really loved that dog. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. I didn't want them to think that I were crazy, or demonically possessed or something, as my family is very religious. And I'm not anymore since my teens, but I was raised a very fundamentalist Christian as a young boy, so I was very much convinced that Satan and demons were real. And over time, this memory kind of faded, and I ended up thinking I either dreamt it or simply remembered it wrong. Fast forward to 2007. I was 18, almost 19, and it was the fall of the year. I was working at my first real job while attending college for computer science. Keep this in mind that this time I was totally irreligious. I didn't believe in anything supernatural, extraterrestrial, or anything remotely paranormal. I was an avid reader of prominent atheists such as Richard Dawkins. My job was at a bookstore. It was a chain of bookstores which I think are mostly regional to the south. At this point we had moved to Alabama and had been living in that state for almost 9 years. I had actually just gotten a promotion to work at the store's joint coffee shop as a barista, but I also still sometimes worked at the register or did stocking. The first time I encountered this man that I will refer to as the rancher, I was actually working the front cash register. I often worked the late night shift there, which was from 4 till 12. We would start closing at around 11:30, though I did most of that by myself, as it was usually just me and one of the assistant managers and a barista for the coffee shop there that late. It was around 11 p.m, and this guy comes in, and I immediately got this strange feeling about this guy. The reason I'll call this guy the rancher is that he was dressed like a cowboy straight out of a western film or even a rodeo. I had family in Texas, so I had been to rodeos before, and I mean this guy was just very strange to be walking in a bookstore at 11 p.m, decked out in snakeskin cowboy boots, a cowboy hat, and western-looking clothes. I thought at first he was just a tourist or something, and went back to reading. I read books in the evening, because we didn't get a lot of people buying books that late. We mostly stayed open, because there were loads of groups that liked our coffee shop, and I guess they made money off it being open in the evenings. This guy walked to the back at some point for a good 20 minutes. Then I was about to make a closing announcement, as I usually do at 11:30, and he came up to the counter with 4 books. I thought the selection was a very strange mix of material. One of them was a physics book, one of them an automotive manual, one of them something on New Age religion, and the other was about martial arts. I honestly don't remember the specific book titles, because what really stuck out about the event was the guy. I could barely look away from him while I was helping him check out. I started getting this feeling that something about this guy's body was fake. His skin was extremely pale, but not that out of the realm of possibility, but very unusual. He was the whitest man I've ever seen, without being an obvious albino or something. But the other thing were his eyes. They were beady. They almost looked like glass eyeballs. Maybe like he was wearing contacts. But it was really hard to tell exactly why they looked that way. He smiled at me as well for the entire time, and it was more than just a friendly grin. It was almost like a sexual flirtation or something. At the end, when I had just finished ringing him up and bagging his books, I realized he hadn't said anything to me, and I had been making my usual niceties, which I like to think of as customer service. But at the end, he stopped for a minute and stared at me before leaving and asked, "What did you say your name was?" I thought this was really bizarre at the time, because 1, I had a name tag on, and 2, I never told him my name during the entirety of the conversation. But for some reason though, he acted as though I did tell him and he had just forgotten. I told him what my name was, and he was like, "Oh, that's a nice name. I'll have to ask for you if I return here." At this point, I just thought this guy was hitting on me or something. He was really creepy, and I just wanted him to leave as soon as possible. Thankfully, he did. Unfortunately, I would see him one more time after about 3 weeks. It was late again, a little after 10 p.m, and this time I was actually working in the coffee shop. I was making coffee drinks for a group of students that came in to do a study group or club or something like that. They did come pretty often. And while I turned around to start giving them their orders, I realized the rancher guy was back there behind them. He was in the same cowboy-like attire, and he was standing there very still, looking in my direction with that same weird smile. It almost seemed forced. I felt this weird sense of dread, and I was reminded of the memory from my childhood, because it was the only other time I had ever felt that type of sensation before. The students left, and he came up and ordered, and he said he wanted a bottle of milk from our mini fridge. I got it for him and he paid. I watched as he stood there and opened it and started drinking it. Then he paused and said, "It's good, but missing something." He drank half the bottle, and I watched him go over to our cafe area where we had creamer sitting out for people's coffee. He proceeded to pour creamer into the bottle until it was nearly full again, and then resumed drinking the drink and the entire thing in one continuous gulp without breathing. He left to go into the store where the book racks are after that. I was hoping he had left by the time I took my evening break not long after, and made myself a drink, and went to sit by one of the tables on our adjoined patio area. This was at 11 p.m, because I always took my evening break then, when I worked in the coffee shop. I was sitting there reading my book, and trying to enjoy my drink after that unnerving experience, and then I heard our patio door open, and it was the rancher guy again. I realized I was cornered, and he sat down at my table directly across from me. He sat there motionless, but had this weird smile, and he took off his hat and put it on the table. That's when I realized this guy was also bald, and his scalp looked very strange, like it had never had hair at all. It almost looked like rubber. It was very odd. I asked if I could help him find something, thinking maybe he was just being creepy and trying to hit on me again or something. He said my name rather calmly, and then the conversation got very strange and specific. He said, "I'm actually here because you are one of my tasked individuals. I don't know why you're on my list for this area, but you are. And I like you. So I'm going to be frank with you. I'm not entirely human." He paused at this point, and I had that feeling of dread again, even more than before, and I was like crawling out of my skin at this point. I actually panicked and got up, and as I did, he said my address, and I froze and realized that this guy knew where I lived and who I was or something. "Sit down," he said. "You're making this difficult. I'm not going to hurt you. That's not my job. My job is to simply keep track of individuals I've been tasked with. That's all. and I need to ask you a few questions to make sure there aren't going to be any problems." He started smiling again, and it was like a forced smile. It looked fake, and he looked so strange, but I sat down because this guy had threatened me, and he knew where I lived, and I didn't know what else to do other than to see what he wanted, and maybe get more info on him, so that I could tell the police after he left. I'm actually from a certain organization that manages many things here on this planet, and am what you would call a liaison between your kind and them. I am partially them, but mostly one of you, and I am tasked with direct, prolonged communications with your type. He proceeded to ask me some questions about whether or not I had ever seen anything out of the ordinary, and who I might have told about it. Obviously he meant other than him, because I remarked he's freaking me out, and asked if this was some kind of prank. I finally told him about my memory from when I was a kid, and told him that I hadn't told anyone about it. He remarked that that would likely be the reason I was on his list. He also asked me a few other questions, seemingly unrelated. He asked me what I was studying in school, and where I thought I might work after I graduated. He seemed fairly interested if I was considering becoming a military contractor, and also asked about some of my family members' military service. In between each question, he would pause for a good 20 to 30 seconds. I asked him what he was doing after the third time this happened, and he said he was scanning my possible timelines for confirmation. He told me his kind could actually see different spectrums than us, and he was having this conversation with multiple versions of myself. He was making sure none of them were going to become problematic for him, because he hated having to return. After several questions, he gave me that smile that said all done. He got up and said people weren't likely to believe me, but that I should not talk to them about the small black creatures I encountered, or I could meet with someone else from his organization with a different designation, and it may not end as nicely for me. After this, I didn't see the rancher guy again, and I tried to forget the event as best I could. I actually went to therapy for this, and didn't give the therapist specific details about this encounter. She helped me greatly as I was able to finish school. I work as a software engineer now, and have not had any strange occurrences for 12 years. This year, I adopted a dachshund puppy. He's very sweet. He's about 7 months old now, and we like to play outside in the afternoons. A couple of days ago, I was on my porch relaxing when I heard him growling. I have never heard him growl before at anything. He's barked before, but never growled. I rushed over to see what was wrong, because I thought maybe he found a wild animal or something. He was growling at the gap beneath my wooden deck. I looked under there, moving him to the side, and I saw a small dark figure and eyes. I grabbed my pup and ran back upstairs, and inside locked all of the doors. I'm very upset and anxious over this, and have been losing a lot of sleep. I had an exterminator come out, and he said he couldn't find anything even after I begged him to look under the whole area twice, and told him I thought maybe mice or something were under my deck. He found nothing. I am extremely afraid that I might be visited by that bizarre man, or someone associated with him, and if for some reason I go missing, I have set an automated delivery message to go to my brother if I am absent for more than a month. Godspeed. I hope none of you have ever encountered this guy or any of his people.
This was probably back in 2009 or so. I was at my mom's house on Labor Day weekend. My mom and her boyfriend had left to go camping, so my sister and niece came from the city to keep me company. My sister had put my niece to bed and we were just laying in the spare bedroom listening to music and chatting. The spare bedroom was an old sunroom that had been converted, so there was windows everywhere. I'm laying closest to the wall, my sister beside me. I'm looking up above the roof to the window, and I see what looks like a star, but something about it catches my eye. It's brighter and seems to be moving, but not in any direction, more like hovering in the same general area. I watch it for a few minutes and decide it was a satellite or something. My sister leaves to use the bathroom, and when she comes back, she's standing at the side of the bed looking outside. She asks me, "Do you see that?" I get up and look out. It's the exact same thing I had seen, just across the sky now, between two trees. I told her that I had seen it above the roof, and I had checked and it's no longer the original spot. We watched this thing for a good 45 minutes, in orbs slightly bigger than a star twinkling brightly and hovering like a helicopter. We were amazed and scared at the same time. Finally, it drifts between the tree on the right, so we run outside to find it again, only to spot it completely across the sky. We're standing in the middle of the street at like 1 a.m., and one of my neighbors comes out. We ask if he sees it. He says yes. We ask if he has any binoculars, and he goes and grabs them for us. We look at this thing through the binoculars, and we can't make out any detail of its shape or what it's doing, but we can see that it's an orb of light. Looking up close, we can see it circulating from red to green to white rapidly, which made it look like it was twinkling. We watch it for a while longer, then decide that's enough excitement for the evening and go to bed. We wake up to see that other people in town had reported the same type of thing in the sky. That aside, the real creepy part for me was later the next day I was going to take a shower. I take my shirt off and I'm looking at myself head on, and I see something on my side. I turn and there's a perfectly straight scar or scratch or something, about 3 inches long. I mean, this thing was dark and perfectly healed. I'd never had surgery or been hurt there or anything. It just appeared on my body the day after I saw that thing in the sky. I still have the mark, it's just way more faint now.
To this day, I still wonder if I was somehow tripping on something I ate by accident, or something else. This was around when I was 10 years old, and I was playing in a room by myself. It was about 11 p.m, and I had a sliding glass door in my room, and the blinds were pulled back. Out of nowhere, the automatic spotlight behind my house turned on. I looked at the sliding glass door and saw a figure started approaching it. At first I thought it was my neighbor, who was older than me and about the same height. But as it got closer, I realized something else. I remember it approached the door slowly. It stopped at the sliding glass door for a few seconds and just started staring at me. It felt like an eternity passed by. Like, I remember specifically how long it felt, when in reality it was probably no more than a few seconds. It was really dark black. It had a rounded head, just like you see aliens in the movies, and was about 6 feet tall, with 2 arms and 2 legs. Really skinny. The thing about it is that it was so close to me on the right, on the other side of the glass, that there's no way I could have mistaken it for a human. I know what I saw, and after a few seconds of staring at me, it just turned to the side and moved away. Long strides. It went out of my view, and I immediately ran out of my room, screaming for my mum. She didn't believe me. I had to sleep in my room that night, knowing I had seen a legit alien a few feet away from me earlier. I'm 23 now, and still get chills to this day when I think about it. My eyes start watering when I think about it. I know it was not a dream. I know what I saw, and no one believes me. The thing that creeps me out the most was its demeanor. I remember it coming slowly up to me and walking slowly away. That's what scares me the most. There was no way to rush into it. It was just watching me. I believe in aliens, but I don't really believe in aliens visiting Earth, so it's been hard to cope with. I think what I saw, if in reality it was an alien, it was what they call a grey. I think we may have seen the same thing.
Yesterday I wasn't able to sleep peacefully as I had hoped so. I used anything to distract myself and even ended up watching some comedy on Netflix. I suddenly grew tired around 9 p.m. and decided it was time to sleep. School will be starting on Monday again, and it was a great idea to sleep early since I have to wake up fairly early. Ever since I was little, I would always have my back face the wall and stay as close as possible to the wall. My door is always closed since I do not like to have it open and it feels like someone is watching me. I woke up after a while. My room had become so cold that I was starting to shiver. What seemed way too strange is that I was able to see my own breath. Around February, it gets very cold in my country, but never has my house been that cold. I tried to sit up and grab a blanket, but once my eyes moved towards the door, it was open. My parents never check up on me because they know I don't like it. Immediately, I was scared and tried my best to stay as calm as possible. The only thing that came to mind, it had been one of my little brothers who decided to grab some money from me. The thought made me want to roll my eyes, but it calmed me down. As I finally sat up and walked over to my door to close it, the sudden fear of someone watching me quickly washed over me. I immediately ran for the door and closed it, turning on the small lamp I have on my desk. My eyesight isn't that great, and I thought that I scared myself because I couldn't see anything. The little lamp made it easier for me to recognize figures and objects around my room. The feeling of a large hand pressing on my back made me freeze. I could feel the icy touch of a hand, and at first, I thought someone had broken into my house. But if it was a burglar, they would have tried to knock me out, or hide until I returned back to bed. Turning around, I expected nothing to see and hoped that there was nothing. Right in front of me stood a very tall gray humanoid figure, with a transparent-like coat on. I didn't dare to look up at its face. Its body was very thin, way too thin for a human. What made me panic even more was the shape of the hand. There were 4 long fingers. It did try to reach out for me again, but that was when I decided to look up at the creature once before. It had such a long, thin neck, and the chest showed me some weird bones. It wasn't bones, but some type of tight skin wrapped around it. I'm not even sure if it was bones. The mouth was very thin, almost like someone drew a small little line on it. The face sent shivers down my spine. What seemed to be a chin seemed to be very pointy and thin. Its black insect-like eyes made me back up to the door, not being able to remove myself from it or even take a run. I was so scared I had no idea what was going on. But I did know what it was. They've appeared literally almost everywhere in this time. Let it be from TV, music videos, or even games. This was a well-known alien. My body was screaming for me to run. I did the best thing I could do around that time, ignoring the scary, tall alien. I kicked my books off the table. The alien seemed to be confused or even shocked, probably thinking why I did that, but I just knew who to alarm before things would go bad. I heard the familiar footsteps of my father, laughing softly as I stared at the alien's black eyes. It didn't move at all, but it seemed like the thing was floating, and slowly, it suddenly glowed and disappeared before my father was able to open the door and look what was happening. I didn't explain what had happened to him, and told him that I bumped against the desk. He did ask me why I was sleeping so early. Apparently, it had only been 9:27 p.m. Whatever that thing wanted from me, it wasn't something good. Tonight I refuse to sleep alone in my room. I don't feel safe at all.
This happened back in the fall of 2015. At the time I was doing long distance with my girlfriend and was loving the bachelor life. That meant crappy YouTube rabbit hole documentaries, ancient aliens, the whole 9 yards. No drugs at all. So I'm 4 hours deep into Stephen Greer's video, and he's talking about what he does out in the desert with some of his followers. And I totally expected this to look fake, but it really did seem like they were seeing UFOs, and were able to invite/summon them, for lack of a better term. And Dr. Greer talks about how if you want to have an experience, you can do this on your own. So I did. I was feeling brave. Aliens scare me, but after 4 hours of Dr. Greer telling me they're so nice, I figured what the hell? Let's give it a shot. The results were as follows. So it must have been around 1 to 2 a.m. I'm laying in bed before I go to sleep, and I picture myself directly above where I am laying, on the roof of my house, shooting a floodlight into the sky from the top of my head. I forget if this was what Dr. Greer, or if that was something I picked up from somewhere else. Keep in mind, this is just me picturing/visualizing. This is no X-Files stuff quite yet. And I'm asking the universe/night sky/aliens in my head, kind of like a radio, for an experience. And I make it very clear in my mind that I do not want to be scared, and that I get scared by the idea of aliens very easily. Eventually I fall asleep. What happens next is hard to describe. I wake up, and I'm sitting up in bed, sleeping on a mattress on the floor. I'm facing the door at a diagonal angle, and I see this light. This light is like nothing I've ever seen before or since. It is the brightest, most penetrating light I've ever seen, but it didn't hurt my eyes to look at it. In fact, it was kind of nice. It was mostly gold with yellow, green, and blue rays coming out of it. Like it couldn't make up its mind on what color it wanted to be. I've never done psychedelics, but I wonder if this is what people would describe if they choose to. There was a silhouette of two skinny little legs sitting in front of the light, kind of swaying a little. I couldn't tell you if this lasted 30 or 3 seconds. All that I remember is that I felt like, okay, that's neat, and went back to sleep unceremoniously. I didn't hear a voice in my head, at least I didn't think I did, and felt like I just wanted to go back to sleep. At the time, I wasn't scared in the slightest, which in retrospect didn't make a lick of sense, as I suspect this little green or grey visitor wanted it that way and had a hand in it. The next day I am cold sweating, and I'm not well to say the least. I barely show up to work, and while I'm at work I go through the motions and maybe say a sentence or two the entire day. Same thing for almost the entire week. The day after, I tried to draw what I saw and remembered, thinking it would help. I felt like I needed to. It was pretty much exactly what I had described to you. Conclusion: I'd had a handful of dreams about aliens before. In all of them I'm scared, having a fight, with no fight or flight reflex. So the dreams just ended up being Conan fests, with me punching greys in the face, terrified. During the dream I wasn't scared at all, not even a smidge. I've never dreamed of me being off-world or anything like that. I also had cold sweats for days, and made it difficult to talk about or even write about. My story seems pretty tame compared to some other accounts, but it is quite spooky, and I never have had sleep paralysis or sleepwalked.
So this first came about sometime when I was about 11 or 12 years old, which puts this around 2009 or 2010. I can't really remember which, I just know it was the point when I frequently stayed with my great-grandma shortly before my great-granddad died of cancer. It is in northwest Georgia, in Chattooga County. Pretty rural by most standards, just a couple thousand people around. Anyways, I had been staying with my great-grandparents then, in their rather large house in a very rural neighborhood of about 4 houses, all sparsely spread out the end of the road, somewhere near a nice lake and park. At some time around 1 a.m., I decided to get up from my bed, walk down the long hall to the living room, and get myself a glass of water from the kitchen that basically connects directly to the living room. Walk down the hall as normal, but when I approached the doorless entry to the living room, I instantly felt like something was wrong. It felt like time itself had slowed down, and the moonlight that shined into the living room from our large side windows didn't quite look right. I then understood what was so amiss to me. The lights in the living room were on, but in a way not so. There was a yellowish light that someone had cut the lights on as normal, but it wasn't the same as what I had always grown up with. It was slightly off. Anyways, I walked a few steps around the corner thinking I had figured out what was bothering me so much. Well, I was wrong. I turned the corner, and the midpoint of the room, about 6 or 7 feet from me, was a tall figure in an obscure cloak. To the left and right of him were 2 much smaller figures, but they seemed to disappear as soon as I focused any attention to them. I can't even be sure what they looked like. The smaller ones were the classic gray alien shape that I am now aware of, but wherever I tried to glance to them, they just sort of faded to an indescribable there but not there shape. The best way I can describe it is if a shape became the static you would see on TV, or if they had been drawings, they would have been hastily scribbled in. My eyes darted from the tall figure to them, at which point they sort of disappeared, and then back to the tall figure. This was all I could do before the tall one was alerted seemingly by them disappearing. The tall one was somehow much more unnerving than the other two. When I looked at him from behind, he was incredibly tall, reaching the ceiling. He had to hunch over a small bit in order to not hit his head. That was the strangest thing, though. When viewed from behind, his back cloak only extended up to the height of a very tall person, and ended. But when he turned around, he was much taller. It was like his head was totally invisible from behind. Now the tall one is the biggest thing about this whole story. He turns around and it's like everything around me just warped. Remember when I said earlier that everything felt wrong or out of place in this general area? It got intensified by several orders of magnitude as soon as he turned around. Somehow seemed to gain several feet in height and looked at me. He seemed very surprised that I was there. Sound seemed to completely fade away, but I remember exactly what he smelled like. I couldn't place it then, but after spending the next several months visiting my great-granddad in the hospital, and then going to his funeral, I can affirm that it was the smell of death. The kind of smell that you only find in places with people dying. It was very particular. Not a horrible stench, but you can feel its morbidity. It's like it thickens the air. The moment he turned around and looked at me, two things happened. First, I became instantly paralyzed. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I could only stand. I didn't feel like I was there. I couldn't help but think that I shouldn't be there. I had an instant overwhelming feeling that I shouldn't be there at that exact moment in time, that exact place. Secondly, I saw his face. It was very much like what we would consider the standard gray alien face, although incredibly white. Not a bright white, but an unnaturally white form of white. Just dulled a bit. Blemish-free, no hair, no variance in coloration. He had a large conish head, small mouth, small nose holes, etc. But his almond-shaped eyes were absolutely horrifying. I don't think I've ever seen anything remotely as disturbing. They looked like they didn't belong in this plane of existence, like a 2D or 4D object existing in a 3D world. I could only see his face, the rest of which I could assume to be his body still underneath his black cloak. The worst thing came next. He seemed to just look at me in some form of panic curiosity for a moment or two, with me still paralyzed literally in fear. Then he produced a long arm from the side of his cloak, with thin, elongated fingers. He bent his body towards me as though one would bend over to pick up something, but bent forwards towards me. His mouth seemed to expand impossibly wide for his head. His hand creeped closer to me, and right as it touched my face, I lost consciousness and woke up the next morning. The scariest part of the whole ordeal was what I felt when he saw me. I was sure he was going to kill me, but not in a way you would expect, like getting stabbed or shot. When he saw me, I felt like every part of me would be absolutely annihilated. I'm atheistic, and still was at the time, but it felt like for that one brief moment, I had a soul, and he was going to steal it from me. It's such an immense feeling of dread, thinking that even more than your every life is about to become nothing. When I woke up, everything was not as it was, and when I had went to sleep or when I had woken up originally to get some water. That is what scares me most to this day, confirming to me that this was not a simple dream. While I had originally went to sleep in my bed in a room down the hall from the living room, I woke up in an obscure position on the living room couch. It was early in the morning, probably about 6 or 7 a.m., judging from the light from outside. So I went back into my bedroom and crawled into my bed. It was only after I made it into my bedroom that I remembered what had just happened to me. I became absolutely mortified, covered myself under a blanket, and waited until I heard the sounds of my great-grandma cooking bacon in the kitchen. That was when I came out of my room and went back into the living room. Fast forward about 2 years later, my great-granddad is dead. I'm a bit older, and I kept having dreams about the tall one that I saw that one night. I had these dreams somewhat often, and every time I woke up in a cold sweat, usually unable to sleep for the rest of the night. The dreams are most frequent shortly after the first encounter, and every night for 4 nights in a row before the second, which I now detail. The second time I saw him, it played much out like the very first. I got out of bed sometime around 2 or 3 a.m. I went to the kitchen to get a Dr. Pepper this time, instead of water. Around 3/4 of the way down the hall, I remembered what had happened that night, and I instantly froze. I could feel them close again. I could feel the aura of wrongness that I had originally felt before the first time I saw them. I tried to turn around and sneak back to my room, or my grandma's, or my grandparents who had come to live with us after the death of the great-granddad. I couldn't turn around, though. I felt absolutely compelled to continue to the living room. It was like I didn't have a choice, but I suddenly felt very okay with the idea. Like I was calm despite what I knew was going to happen to me. Sure enough, in the living room was the tall one, but he was already facing the entrance to the living room, where I was walking from, and he was unaccompanied this time. He also didn't smell this time. There was no smell, but I can hear a faint humming that sounded like it was coming from outside. We lived near a highway, so it could have been a car, but it didn't sound like one. He knew I was there, and I'm pretty sure he was the one that calmed me and forced me to come into the living room. He seemed much more approachable this time, but he did the exact same thing as before. He studied me for a moment with a small smile, and then put me to sleep with his hand. Again, I woke up on the couch. When I woke up, I felt less horrified about what had happened and more curious as to why. And I remember distinctly feeling like I was trapped by fate into seeing him multiple times, like I was sure it would happen again, whether I wanted it to or not. Throughout the years, I never distinctly remembered meeting him again, but he did appear in my dreams. I moved twice and he was still there every 4 to 6 months. Sometimes it was singular appearances in my dreams, other times it was me waking up 3 nights in a row. On the 4th night, after I had had the 3rd dream, I stayed up at night, sitting in the living room of my new house, waiting to see him. But I never saw him. Instead, I woke up still in the living room, but upside down against my couch, with my legs up in the air, my upper back on the floor, and my lower back resting on the edge of the couch cushion. Several blankets were haphazardly spread around me, and my underwear was around my knees for some reason. I guess he knocked me out before I was able to see him, and he did whatever he does. In all this time, I still have no idea what he was actually doing, or why it was me. I still was very unnerved every time he was in my dreams, but I was less surprised. I haven't had a dream about him in nearly 2 years now, but I am posting this because I recently had a dream with a different entity. I'm pretty sure it was one of the smaller beings that were with the tall one on the first encounter. He was a very stereotypical small gray alien, wearing a dull red, almost maroon cloak. He greeted me, and long story short, we wound up talking about a lot of things. He told me about the eventual fate of the world succumbing to environmental issues if we don't stop pollution. He told me of the countries of the world forming superpowers, eclipsing most smaller nations, one of them being formed from the US, the other from Russia, and 1 or 2 others coming from Australia and its surrounding lands, or maybe somewhere a short distance off the coast of southern Brazil. I'm not 100% sure, but I do remember the ones about US and Russia. I then asked him if he could share any technological information with me, and he said he could, but it would be limited, and he was only permitted to show me a few things. I asked him for a source of limitless power, and he drew up this diagram for me. It struck me as an electrical diagram of some sort, but I knew this made no sense, so it may be something else entirely. It was a bit ago, so I can't be 100% certain of the exact diagram, but that's as close of an approximation as I can get. Maybe try hypnosis of some form to recall it better. I do know, however, that some sort of diagonal resistor-like symbol was in that location. There was some type of bulb-looking structure on the right side, although it may be inverted as compared to what's in the picture. And I know there was a series of boxes with overlapping lines on the left.
This isn't my story, but one a friend told me not long ago that I found fascinating, mostly because of the genuine emotion in his telling of it. The fear in his voice, and on his face, was visceral and contagious as he told the story, even though it happened years ago when he was a kid. About 15 years back, a friend of mine and his group of friends were out having their fun of our little Rust Belt town not too far from a big city, doing all the things kids do before they discover drugs and girls and all the other things that take you out of your childhood sense of adventure. In particular, they went out into this part of town we call the Flats, originally zoned industrial, but after the big fiber plant closed, nature reclaimed the place for the most part. So it was fields and woods once, but you got past the big dilapidated factories that sit by the tracks. For obvious reasons, the parents around there tell their kids to keep well away from that area, because it could be seriously dangerous. But the thing that strikes me as odd about this part of town is that there have constantly been rumors that there was some kind of waste material that's just buried out there that's toxic, allegedly radioactive, and or related to the Manhattan Project. It's become local folk wisdom that there's something out there you don't want to get into, since my dad was a kid in the 50s. My friend and his posse were playing Manhunt, which I'm told is basically hide and seek, and so he was going through the woods looking for his friends who were hiding pretty successfully from him. He reaches a break in the trees, steps out onto a small meadow, and that's when he sees it. Across the field, about 20 yards away, there was something squatting in the tree line, clad in all silver and a bulbous helmet, looking almost like some astronaut from a D-grade sci-fi flick. It saw him in the same instant he saw it. It leapt in surprise, but there was something off and almost simian about the stance it took up when it leapt, almost like a chimp in a spacesuit, but taller and close to a human. Just as quickly, it raised its arm, pointed, and somehow fired a tiny metal dart at my friend, which hit him in the hand as he turned to run. He ripped the thing out of his hand while running and screaming for his friends. As he told me this with a shaky voice, he showed me the small scar on his hand. I'm a skeptical person, and it's a cheesy story, but this is a guy who's not capable of faking the trembling voice and faraway look of someone who's remembering something that terrified them. I insisted we go look around that place after hearing this, but we found nothing strange, except for a weird-looking warehouse-type building closer to the freeway than the woods that was relatively new, an empty wilderness. To this day I have no clue what he saw, but I believe he did see something.
It has been 5 days since I saw that alien. I really did think it left me alone and decided to play with someone else. But I was wrong. My parents haven't been able to help me either, only thinking that I need some help while my siblings are a bit on edge too. I don't know what it wants from me, or why it keeps appearing, but I'm getting sick of it. I've been searching everywhere for answers, and all I get is people having difficulties to find answers too. However, this time, this experience got even worse. For being sick of my last encounter with the creature, I wasn't able to get much things done. I'm way behind with my projects, and my boss has been nagging that I need to come to work, only for her to send me back. I think it is the flu that has made me sick, which I shouldn't give the alien the fault. After I returned home, I decided to take a shower. Since I wear contacts, I had to take them out to prevent for them to sticking on my eyeballs. This would mean for me that I can't see much and everything is blurry. Still in the shower, I could hear a few noises and some objects falling on the floor. Immediately, I thought it was my family. They are always searching for some things. Once the noise got closer to the bathroom, I immediately could feel myself tensing up. Panicking, I quickly shut the water and wrapped my bathrobe around me. Carefully getting out of the shower, my eyes immediately moved to the door. Just as I thought it was finally over, there stood the alien. The same one I had seen from the night before. This time I was able to see it much brighter than the first time. It was very tall, and those scary eyes made me almost want to scream for help. When I did try to do that, it seemed like my voice was gone. The fear had me freeze, but being unable to move or talk. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, only for the alien to get closer to me. This time I did force myself to calm down and think of something to do. I asked what it wanted from me. This made the alien stop walking, staring at me once again as it lightly moved its head. It reached its hand down towards me, only for me to flinch and back up as much as possible. This didn't make the alien stop at all. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to tell this was some kind of nightmare. I did feel something on the top of my head, and I guess it had placed its hand on me, but I didn't care to open my eyes. A sudden voice filled my head, telling me to calm down, and that it won't hurt me. What made me even more freaked out was that I heard my own voice. I have no clue what had happened after that. Apparently my mother had found me on the floor. I think I might have fainted, but I'm not so sure. My hair was still wet, including my face when my mother had found me. Whatever that thing wants from me, it can keep it.
I was staying at a friend's house in Hollywood in the guest room, and was trying to sleep. I think I passed out for an hour or so, but I ended up waking up and being unable to fall back asleep. I do not believe this was sleep paralysis or a dream, because I was fully conscious and awake when it happened. I was also able to move and speak and see the room decently, even though it was dark. I've had sleep paralysis a few times before. It's very rare for me, and I didn't feel paralyzed or panicked. I was listening to music with my earbuds in, and my eyes closed, when I felt the presence of something in my room and a tap on my arm. It startled me a bit, and I sat up straighter when I saw in the dark, right beside my bed, the figure of a woman. I couldn't make out much of her features, but she was probably 5'2" and hunched over with very pale skin that seemed to glow. She had messy mid-length black hair, several necklaces, and long earrings. She moved in a very fluid manner and almost seemed to glide as she walked and reached out towards me. She seemed to be trying to hide her face by holding her hand over it and pulling her hairs across it. She held out a handwritten note that had many of the lines on it scratched out aggressively. It seemed like it was about my life. I don't know exactly what happened, but I swear she was able to telepathically communicate with me, and she said, "It's better this way, don't you think?" as she handed me the note to look at. I was almost in a trance or something, because I was in absolute awe of what was happening. But I handed the note back without absorbing any of it and said, "Yeah, I agree," out loud. She took it back and quickly turned away, and just like that was gone, and my door was left open. It took me a good minute to try and process what happened, and I quickly ran over to my friend and his girlfriend's room, and asked them if she had come into my room, but she said otherwise. She told me she was having trouble sleeping too, and had seen some odd flashes of light outside her window a few times that night. I went outside to smoke a cigarette, and felt an incredible sense of peace and calmness overcome me, and I didn't feel worried about the encounter, because throughout it all, I didn't feel like I was in danger. She seemed like she was trying to protect me, or watch over me, and I was okay with that.
I witnessed an alien abduction back in 2006. This occurred when I was 20 years old. It was sometime during the week. I was driving from work straight to my then girlfriend's house for dinner. She lived with her mother, grandmother, and younger sister, so it was just the four of them living at the house. I helped set up the table for dinner. After having dinner, my girlfriend and I spent about 2 hours up in her room, laying around talking and making plans for the coming weekend. It was getting late and I had to be up early the following morning, so I decided to call it a night. I put on my jacket, kissed my girlfriend goodbye, and headed downstairs. I made my way towards the front door, which leads through the kitchen. Before I can even make another move, I saw two creatures leading the younger sister towards the door. I was absolutely stunned. It was so shocking that I felt like I was out of my body watching this happen. They were both small in size, with long arms and a long neck, and wore tight black jumpsuits. I stood there, watching them, walk straight through the wall. There was another one, much taller. His face looked scaled and brown, and he was wearing a robe with a hood over his head. He honestly looked like a lizard. He came out of the bedroom from where the other two came from, leading the way for the younger sister. At this point, I was panting. My heart was racing. I don't remember anything else but waking up next to my girlfriend upstairs in her bedroom. I remember so vividly that this happened. I remember every detail and the fear that overtook my entire being. The sister was spotted by neighbors laying naked and unconscious in the front yard the same night. I told my girlfriend everything I saw. She told me that this has been occurring since she was a child, and they kept it as a family secret. This was also a big reason why their father had left them years ago. After this experience, there's been other paranormal happenings at that house, particularly with the sister. We continued to date for a little over a year after the first occurrence had finally broke up, but kept in touch for several years, and the strange happenings only got more and more intense.
From when I was young, I had nightmares. Nightmares about giants. These giants could see through the windows, they were so tall and thin. If there was a gap around the shades, they could still see in. If I hid under my mother's bed, the dust ruffle didn't go all the way to the floor, so they would still see me. In these nightmares, I would hide in the closet, try to open the door as well as I could, and hide under a pile of clothes. One morning, I woke up in that closet. Throughout my youth, I'd have nightmares of a similar sort. I could not sleep near a window, especially if it was an open window, even in summer. One time, it was tall, skinny monkeys on the roof trying to get in, or it would be triangular objects in the sky flying at very high speeds. All the time, I knew nothing of aliens, and I joined a group that dealt with all manner of oddness, including UFOs. I mentioned these nightmares, and they were convinced that I was an abductee. It began making sense, as these nightmares would often occur about the time I was ovulating, including one nightmare when I woke up on a table in a room, with something like a huge metal bowl inverted in me. I swore I could hear my mother's voice telling me I was okay, and that they weren't going to hurt me. They needed to just do these tests. Then, I saw them. I watched them stick a very long and thin needle-like tool into my abdomen on the left, as they extracted an ova, which they showed me. I saw it as if it were magnified, roundish cream-coloured, with an area that was a little more brownish. They explained to me this one was damaged, and they'd need another. I remember thinking, cool. Then realising what I said and what was going on, I pretty much passed out and not woke up again until the morning. As I said, this was a regular occurrence, until one year during ovulation, I happened to be on a military base. Apparently they weren't going to arouse the ire of the US military. After that, the abductions ceased. I was getting older anyway, and my viability was probably not up to snuff. Fast forward many years, I was house-sitting way out in a rural area. There are neighbours, but they're a bit spread out. But they're 15 miles from the nearest town in a heavily wooded area. I'd gone to bed around 1:32 and had turned off all the lights and gotten to bed facing the window and closed my eyes. Soon, I could tell there was light shining in through the window. Odd but not completely unheard of that someone would be driving down that road a little late. I then realised I didn't hear gravel, and the light didn't seem to move. Was someone sitting outside my house with their headlights on? I got out of bed and peeked through some blinds, and saw what made me do a backflip and go over to the bed to get my glasses. I slammed them on my face, bounced back to the window, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Across the street is nothing but a line of trees. Behind those trees were huge white lights, the size of the full moon, drifting very slowly downwards at an angle. When the white lights were behind the trees, I could see red lights around them. Back behind those trees is nothing but a very large swamp. There was no noise, and I stood there staring blankly until I could no longer see the lights. Needless to say, there was no sleep to be had on my part, and I kept looking out the windows, expecting to see little green men out in the front yard. It was a little easier to handle when I could put my experiences down to just nightmares, but I was too well aware and fully awake for this one.
At Christmas dinner, we were all just having a casual conversation, and my great-grandma, a woman who has never mentioned anything remotely alien or spacecraft-ish, said, "Oh, and I saw something kindly peculiar last night. I turned off the television and I was going to bed. Right outside over yonder," she points in the direction of the neighbor's yard, "there was a spaceship? One of those things that go in the sky. It was sitting over there in the yard there." At this point, I kind of just stared at her wide-eyed. This house that we're all in the very same house that I think I used to have recurring visitations from when I was much younger. It's a long one, but if you want to read the full story here. As she was describing how it looked like an egg and was flashing back and forth with a green and blue light, I was starting to remember those visitations that I hadn't thought about in years, and excused myself from the table because I was having a panic attack. In a way, it feels good to finally have some kind of external validation for my own story, that it could have happened, especially from someone I was completely not expecting it from, but at the same time, it's terrifying. I would have liked to dismiss the possibility of aliens hanging around my great-grandma's house as a dream or sleep paralysis.
I live on the west coast of British Columbia in Canada. About midway up the coast, I was driving my girlfriend back to her granddad's house, 2 towns over from mine. It's about a 2.5-hour drive on the highways. I had driven her home and spent the day visiting her family. This town she is from is right on the coast. It's a port city. The point is that I'd spent the day there and was now getting ready to drive home. On about 25 to 30 minutes into the drive, I'm on the highway that runs parallel to the mouth of the river on one side, and the CN tracks on the other. So it goes rail on my left, the road I'm on, and then a sort of mini channel where the river ends. I'm driving, it's getting dark, but I'm not tired or drowsy at all. There are a few rest stops along the road on my right, on the riverbank, and I need to slow down because I have to urinate. Then something scurries across the road. And that's almost all that happened. It was 4-legged, at least from what I saw. Black. Blacker than black. Unnaturally dark. No texture or anything. It was void of light or colour, just in the shape that it was. It ran out of the bush over the rails, and I was going slow enough that the wind and the highway noise was gone, and I heard it. It sounded like metal tapping as it ran over the ballast and rail. Then the sound if you took a rod or rebar and stabbed it into the ground. Then metal again as it ran in front of me, across the road. Its body was shaped like how some people described a UFO, almost flat-like, like an overall stretched out thing with legs protruding from the front and back. It had no features, no eyes, no face, nor mouth that I could tell, and it ran across the road, limbs stretching as it did so. Then it ran into the rest area and over into the bank, and I'm guessing into the river. I kept driving, and didn't go until I went home 2 hours later. I've tried searching for this thing online but had no luck. If anyone could help me out in trying to figure out what it is, I'd seriously appreciate it. I've drawn a picture, and you'll find it in the description.
Ever since I was able to remember when I first looked up at the sky, I knew something was off. My parents didn't allow us to watch a lot of TV when we were younger. We only played outside or inside with our toys. Now that I am 19 years old, my mother decided to tell me some stories when I was little. At the age of 4, I apparently had told her that I wanted to go into space. Everyone would think is something silly and not to worry about it. But my mother did when she asked a simple, why? My 4-year-old self had told her that the stars are calling for me, telling me to come home. Around 2007, when I was 8 years old, my space obsession became worse. I looked up every planets and stars in the library. My father had told my mother it was a thing kids did and told her not to worry about it. She did believe him, but I asked her once if she saw the tall man in the hallway a few days ago. My father, who doesn't like to see me afraid, sad, or worried, yelled at me to never talk about that again. Since that day, I'm not able to remember a lot of things. This is where the scary parts start to come. I've never seen the face of an alien when I was little on a computer or TV. I did know how they looked like. I'm able to even remember that I stood in a white room, a big large window that made it easier for me to see the stars. It was beautiful, but I wasn't panicking at all. Not even when the tall man appeared to take my hand and lead me somewhere else. It was as if I had a strange connection with that thing, and now I'm not able to sleep peacefully as I did when I was little. I'm terrified of the dark for an unknown reason, and aliens are starting to scare me. I don't know what's going on and why I've been like this. And the funniest thing, what my parents always tell me, is that they have picked the wrong baby from the hospital. I don't look like them at all. I'm very pale and my eyes are big almond-shaped. No one has this in my family. Of course, it isn't something to worry about, but I want to know what kind of connections I have with that tall alien. I have to cut this short as I do not have much time. I do wish to tell more, and I apologize for my English. It isn't my first language.
This encounter happened to a family friend. He said this occurred somewhere in Italy when he was 15. Walking home from a friend's house through a wooded area, a craft appeared hovering above the trees and approached him. He didn't give a description of the craft or say if it landed or not, but told me there were people inside. I'm not sure if he could see into the craft, or if they left the vehicle, but he said they were around 4 to 5 feet tall. I asked if he was scared, but he said no. He was very excited and overwhelmed with happiness. He said he waved and they waved back, then spoke to him. Again, I'm not sure if he meant verbally or telepathically. And he said they invited him to go with them, far away. But he politely declined, stating he was happy here and didn't want to leave. They departed in the craft and he hurried home, excitedly telling his mother of his encounter. She wasn't pleased to hear his story, and told him never to tell anyone else. They would think badly of him, and also possibly of her. I'm not sure if she even believed him or not. He told me this story with tears in his eyes, saying he was grateful for the experience and still remembered the overwhelming joy he felt at the time. I'd known him since I was a young child and trusted him completely. He was always very serious and never joked or lied, as far as I knew. His story surprised me, as I'd never expected him to be the type of person to experience something like this. His emotion in telling me convinced me even more than just trusting his honesty. I'd never seen him so emotional on any other occasion, which made this so much more significant to me.
My parents decided it was a good idea to send me off on a small vacation with my grandparents to Turkey. They thought it was a great idea to have myself relax after such a stressful year. I went to a doctor after my first experience, thanks to my parents, who only sent me to a therapist to see if something is wrong with me. So far, no one believes me for what I've seen, but that doesn't stop me from believing it. My grandparents have this small house in a village. The next neighbor is kilometers away, which makes it almost impossible to visit someone else. However, there are barely any trees. It's always very hot around June, and sleeping at night seems way too difficult than anyone thinks. My grandparents were already sleeping, and since there was nothing to watch on TV, I decided to call an end to the day and sleep outside. Of course, I didn't actually go outside, but used the balcony instead, as I didn't want to wake up with a snake around me. Getting down from the balcony is just asking for broken bones. I grabbed some pillows and a few blankets after I turned the lights on. Sleeping in the dark isn't really something I enjoy a lot, not after the many experiences I've had. The light seemed more for my own comfort than anything else, but I already could feel something was off. It was suddenly colder outside than it was a minute ago, and this awful feeling of being watched started to make me paranoid. I quickly looked back inside, but I saw nothing and shrugged it off, thinking I was making myself paranoid. That was, at least, what I had really thought. Once my eyes traveled down to the garden, I saw something way too familiar. It was dark outside, but my eyes never betray me for what I've seen in the light I had. Below me stood a very tall, grayish-white, tall gray. It was very tall and skinny. I'm not really sure how tall, but definitely taller than an average human. Its shoulders were very thin and the arms reached its knees. But to make it a bit clearer, it literally looked like those toys you could stretch, mostly their limbs. All it did was stare at me as I stared back at it. I'm not sure how long this had lasted, but when I blinked my eyes, the creature was all of a sudden a bit closer than it was before. That's when I knew that it knew I was there. I was frozen in fear and the alien moved its head a bit to the side, only to move it back straight, as if it was curious to see me. After a bit, I finally got the courage to do something. Instead of freaking out like always, I thought it was a better idea to react calmly. The first thing I did was wave my hand slowly at it, only to have the same response back after a few minutes. As much as I tried not to freak out, I only became even more scared. I asked what it was doing here, but that was when I felt my whole body becoming stiff. My mind was telling me to scream for help, someone to come and get this creature away. I knew one thing for sure. It wanted something from me, something I had no idea of what it could be. I asked the creature again why it was here and only got a reaction by moving its head a bit off to the side, as if it was curious. The alien moved a bit closer, standing right underneath me, looking up at me with those big black eyes. I wasn't able to see a mouth before, but now I could. I was shaking in fear, not knowing why it was standing this close. A loud voice of a man called for me, asking what I was doing on the balcony in the middle of the night. My eyes quickly moved to the police officer of the village, who was always driving around at night. However, once my eyes met the officer's, I quickly looked back down, only to see that the alien had disappeared. The officer saw how alarmed I was, as it was easy to see that I was shaking and nearly at the point of falling on my knees. All I did was say that something was in the garden, and that's when the officer quickly entered the garden to check if someone was there. However, he told me he saw nothing, and called a few other officers to check the surrounding. My grandparents were woken up by them and told them what happened. However, my grandfather, who has a bit of an obsession with aliens, asked me many questions about the alien I saw. It seems like it isn't the first time this has happened at all, and that it has become common in our family that encounters like this happen. But what I did learn was that my grandfather was, or still is, an abductee.
A little backstory. I go to school about 6 hours from my hometown. The drive to and from school is along a long and mostly empty stretch of interstate through the desert. There are at least 2 military bases along the drive, and a major nuclear plant is also located near the interstate. The area is known for weird sightings, especially at night. Aside from that, it's mostly cactuses, sand, and cattle. I was driving home from school in late June of this year, and was able to leave around 6 p.m, meaning I'd be able to make most of the drive in the dark and get home at around midnight. It didn't bother me. I liked driving alone, and at night, and for the most part didn't really scare me. It gives me a sense of independence and adventure. About 3 hours into my drive, I get to the other side of the second military base. At this point it's pitch black, and for the most part I was on the road alone. I saw the occasional car going the opposite direction, but other than that and my high beams, there weren't any other lights besides the moon. Somewhere around this time, I noticed a light paralleling me, and my truck on the passenger side of my truck. I was doing around 95, and it kept up with me effortlessly. I wasn't along the railroad tracks, and there was no road over there, just desert and shrubs. It was not very close to me, and it was above the horizon, so I assumed it was something related to the military base and ignored it. Other lights appeared, and was driving along with the original light. They weren't flares, and I doubt they were military aircrafts, since I didn't think most of these would be equipped with one white light I'd be able to see. The lights were there for about an hour, just following the road, keeping a perfect pace with my truck. I lost them when I started going north on a small local highway. I've never seen anything like it before or since on the many times I've made that drive, and it makes the hairs on my arms stand up, just thinking about it.
Thanks to a lot of people on Reddit for giving me information and trying to help me. I think I've found a few answers, but I can't be all too sure as I'm still trying to figure out why this is happening to me. Apparently, the alien I have seen is a tall gray. At least, that's what people have been calling it. Since I've tried to find some information about them, I only got way too many different stories, which made me question a lot of things. But I decided to go a bit deeper and take the risk to search up about any type of abductions. Before I was able to do that, my computer crashed and I first thought that the people outside, they're changing the roads and this is the first time this has happened, hit something on accident. Luckily, it was around 3 p.m. I ignored it and I decided to call a friend till the electricity decided to work again. My phone started to make a loud buzzing noise and I can't describe how terrible the noise was. It was as if my ears were about to explode. It didn't take long before it stopped with ringing, only to have a weird memory come back to me when I was a bit younger. Living in a city, it is impossible to hear owls or see them. However, I always wanted to see one. When my mother tucked me in bed and tried to close the curtain, she literally stopped moving. I remember how scared she looked and told me to get out of the bed and go to my father downstairs. Being a curious kid, I decided to go look out the window at what she was looking at, only to see her glaring at an owl. What happened next? Well, both my parents ended up panicking and made me sleep with them. I think they've seen something else than an owl. I could be wrong. They could dislike owls for an unknown reason. A month has passed and I haven't seen the alien any longer. I hope he stays away from me. But I've noticed a few men dressed in black walking around in my street quite a lot or in a van. What doesn't surprise me more, it's a black van. One of those men even tried to walk towards me, but I quickly ended up getting in my car. Nothing has happened with those guys and me yet. They're still around and I'm having very strange doctor dreams. One of them is waking up on an ice cold table in my PJs, and a doctor touching my face and checking something. I even remember that I couldn't move my body, only my eyes. They're only really nightmares, only very strange ones. I'll probably post another memory or dream of mine to explain what had happened there. When that'll happen, I'm not sure.
My father's girlfriend told of this experience when she lived alone in an apartment. She once fell asleep in their living room with the lights still on. She suddenly woke up super late into the night and saw this human-like creature staring at her. It was super short like a child, but had a large head and huge ears flapping between them, up and down to float in the air. It had this grotesque grin, and she was basically frozen in fear. After a few moments, the creature just disappeared into thin air. She also had other stories of waking up in the night to something invisible choking her violently.
Been a conspiracy nutball for over a decade now. The past 6 months or so, I've been looking into alien abductions pretty heavily. It was a corner of the conspiracy world that I hadn't really devoted a lot of time to yet, and I was starting to look into it. I thought it would be funny if I started to suspect I'm an abductee, just as a side effect of spending a lot of time on these topics. Well, I don't suspect I'm an abductee, but there is definitely something going on with my family. While I was looking into alien stuff, I recalled my mom saying she once saw a UFO. So I was visiting my family recently and I asked her about it. She saw it in the late 70s or early 80s. I forgot to ask the exact year. Either right before I was born, while she was pregnant with me, or right after I was born. At the time, my folks lived in a country farmhouse out in the middle of nowhere, Illinois. Dad was away on work, it was about 9 p.m., and Mom realized she had forgotten to feed the dogs. She went outside, fed the dogs, and looked up to see a massive black triangle UFO, with 3 red lights, one at the point of each triangle angle. It wasn't too far above the house, made no noise, and she said she stood in shock from seeing a UFO, but even more so with how massive it was. And that's that. I believe she said it just slowly hovered away over the tree line, and she went back into the house. I'll have to ask her if the dogs ate like normal if they were freaked out. See if she remembers that detail. Also, I recall my mom and my little sister joking about my little sister seeing Allens. I asked them what they were talking about, and they said when my little sister was 3 years old, several times she would leave her bedroom in the middle of the night and go into my mom's bedroom, wake my mom up, and ask to sleep with her because there was Allens in her bedroom. Allens were what my 3-year-old little sister called aliens. I thought it was interesting and worth mentioning. One of my trips up to visit my family, a buddy and I were visiting with my dad. My buddy says to my dad that he actually knows some people who do paranormal investigating in that area where my dad lives. My dad says, "Hey, that's interesting," and wanting to hear more about it, which I thought was weird. I never thought of my dad to be interested in the paranormal. While they were discussing this, I spoke up and said, "You know, if you actually experience the paranormal, you don't go looking for it." Side note, I've had an ass ton of paranormal stuff happen to me, but I never discussed it with my dad because, like I said, I never took him for somebody who'd be open-minded to it. My dad looked at me and said, I've had one paranormal thing happen to me." And he told us the following story. Starts off, my dad is in the hospital and he's dying. Side note, my dad has cheated death more than any other human I've ever met. For him to start off a story stating it was in the hospital dying is just par for the course. He said, "Boys, I was dying. I was on my way out, and there was no doubt about that. I had accepted my fate, and the light in the room started fading out, and a darkness started fading in. Just then, 2 men in black suits and hats came into the room. They said, 'Mr. Jones, I'm afraid we cannot allow you to die at this time.' Then they walked back out of the room. My dad miraculously came back to life. A doctor and nurse came running in and said something to the effect of, 'Mr. Jones, you're okay. You look amazing. We weren't thinking you were going to make it.' My dad asked who the men in the black suits and hats were. The doctor stated that he and the nurse had been right outside my dad's room and the nurse's station for some time, and no one had been in or out. One of my earliest paranormal experiences is me and a friend seeing a 1950s Men in Black style Cadillac disappear right in front of us. Also, a year or two after that, I was followed home one night by a mob of shadow people wearing suits, hats, and trench coats, much like the Men in Black, or the shadow apparition known as the Hat Man. Dr. David Jacobs, an expert in UFOlogy and abductions, believes this phenomenon to be generational, and that the paranormal and aliens are basically one and the same. Say your grandparents were abductees, then it might skip a generation to where nothing at all happens to their kids, and then perhaps just one of the grandchildren experience paranormal activity, and then the cycle repeats in ways somewhat similar to that example, which I agree with that theory. Not that it's an explanation for everything weird and paranormal, but I do believe in some people's cases the generational thing applies. Hey guys, the Dark Narrator here, and thank you so much for listening. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit that little bell next to the subscribe button. I do horror narrations over on my channel, typically what you would see here. If you like that type of content, please be sure to subscribe to my channel, and also check out my most popular video, which is "We Know You Are Out There and We Are Coming For You." I worked very hard on that video, and I think it shows exactly what I like to do on my channel. As always, thank you guys so much for watching this video, and if you liked what you heard, please be sure to vote for me on Saturday.